Hey, what's up? It's Jesko again from AcousticSinsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. So have you ever wondered if the acoustic treatment in your studio actually works? And if it does work, how well does it work? It's kind of difficult to judge that because on one hand, it's quite difficult to actually analyze your room and understand what's actually going on with and without the treatment. And then what goals are correct? As in, when are you kind of done with treatment? When have you achieved proper treatment, right? It's kind of difficult to judge. Obviously, one of the ways is to look at acoustic measurements. With something like Room EQ Wizard, you can fairly easily kind of measure your room and get a whole bunch of data that tells you a lot of potentially nothing if you don't know what you're looking at. And that's what I want to talk about in this video, because if you followed me these past 2 weeks, you've seen me talk about this new tool called Audieum by a developer from Italy, Andrea Cicero, who I talked to in last week's video about this new platform, this new tool called Audieum that on one hand lets you analyze the room modes, the standing waves in your studio, even if the room shape is pretty odd. We kind of looked at that these last 2 weeks. But then there's also a tool to analyze your Room EQ Wizard measurements. It's called IR Analysis, and it basically runs through the measurements that you did at your listening position from Room EQ Wizard and then spits out a report analyzing those measurements and giving you the relevant data to understand how well the room is actually treated, both in the time and the frequency domain, and if you've reached the goals of a good listening room. So that's what I want to talk about in this video. But before that, I want to help you out with my home studio treatment framework. If you want to understand where what we're about to talk about actually fits into the whole process of treating your studio, or if you're just kind of wondering what the next step for you needs to be, or maybe you've got an issue in your studio and you don't quite understand how to go about fixing that, what needs to be done in order to kind of straighten that out, then I want you to check out my home studio treatment framework, which you can download for free at the link in the description. These are my 5 steps to systematically treating a home studio and getting it to translate. It's basically all the steps that you need to take, very top level, in order to take your room from untreated to fully treated. So it's all in there, both your listening position and speaker placement, your treatment with porous absorption, when to bring in resonance absorption, when to bring in measurements, as we're about to talk about in this video, how to think about speaker decoupling, when to bring in a subwoofer. It's all in there, laid out systematically in a step-by-step process that you can follow along so that you don't end up turning in circles and working on the wrong thing at the wrong time. Because acoustics and home studio acoustics is kind of the sum of its parts. You need to go through all these different steps that all contribute to the room and the sound from your speakers and you being able to trust what you're actually hearing. So you need to go through those steps in the right order, and that's why I created the home studio treatment framework. So again, if you are in the process of treating your studio, or if you're trying to fix a problem that you don't know about, or you just want to follow along and understand what it is we're talking about in this video, download my home studio treatment for free at the link in the description. So with that, let's put on a sweater and jump into Audieum to see if we can actually tell with IR analysis how well our treatment works. So as before, this is the home page, and I'll have a link to that in the description as well as last time. And once you've kind of opened the IR analysis tool, you're greeted by this website. Audieum IR Analysis is the ultimate way to easily evaluate and improve the acoustic quality of your listening environment for free. What a promise. And so here's basically how it works, right? So you measure your room with Room EQ Wizard. You then upload those files into the IR analysis tool, and it then spits out the report that tells you just how well the treatment actually works. So once you've logged in, and then if we click on the IR analysis tool, we get the My Measurements page where we can actually start uploading new measurements. So I've done this before with these 2 examples here that I'll show you in a second, and one version that I experimented with, but I'm just going to show you what this looks like. So basically, we have to give the room a name. We have to say what kind of room it is. So then we can just input our dimensions. And I'm just going to go with something like this. Ideally, you want those to be the correct dimensions for your room, right? I'm not entirely sure what happens if we don't have a symmetrical room. I've only experimented with symmetrical rooms so far. But I'm guessing you then just kind of either leave this field out with the dimensions. Let's actually see what happens. No. And then you just say that the room is asymmetric, and that should tell the system to do what it needs to do, basically. So then next step, we actually upload the measurements. And so if we go in here, I've prepared 2 files. So these need to be exported from Room EQ Wizard manually, separate channels left and right. And actually, I'm just going to do this. Although what I wanted to show you was that we've actually got a really nice tutorial from our friends over at Music City Acoustics telling you how to use Room EQ Wizard with some steps, so you can actually upload up to 5 measurements per channel for the analysis, but it also works with just 2. And then there's a great guide here to show you how to actually prepare these files for uploading into IR Analysis. But yeah, so once that's done, we're basically greeted with this page here. I'm just gonna click these boxes, submit, and now it does its thing in the background and then spits out the report for us. And another 3 seconds to play the waiting game. So here we are. It now has example 2 in our list of rooms, of measurements. And here's what the condensed report, the room score, looks like, right? So on the left, we've got the details about the room that we submitted. And then on the right, the actual scores separated into these 5 categories: operational room response curve. So that's the frequency response. Stereo alignment. So that's how well the frequency responses of the 2 speakers match. Reverb time, early reflections, and modal decay. All 3 of these are obviously time related and not frequency related. Although, well, they are frequency related, but these are in the time domain. And so these 2 at the top, this is just the overall decay of the room, RT60. Then we've got the control of early reflections. And then modal decay is how long the room modes actually decay in the room. And then we've got this color coding that tells us how well the room performs. As you can see, it doesn't do all too well in this untreated stage, although stereo alignment is pretty good. And apparently early reflections are 100% as well. I'll get into that in a second. So once we actually download the report, I'm just going to use this one here, which is slightly more precise. Once you click on download the report, you're greeted with this PDF that you can download. So let's have a look. So it's split into these 9 major headings, right? So at the top, again, we've got some information about the actual room, then the room score is repeated, and then we've got these 5 metrics that are also represented in the room score, plus we've got spectrograms and low frequency response in here. Yeah, so let's go through them one by one. Room information, this is clear. The one thing that it does tell us is that the entire benchmark by which it judges the quality of the treatment, the quality of the sound, is based on the ITU-R BS1116 standard for critical listening environments. This is basically a standard that was implemented by the ITU to treat listening environments for auditory tests. Okay, so once you're kind of within that threshold that they declare as their standard, the room is then well prepared to do critical listening tests. In terms of studio applications, this sets the bar quite low. I would say this is kind of the lowest common denominator, but it is a benchmark that we can definitely use to evaluate how well the room sounds. So here we have the room score again, as we had before. As you can see, well, what we had before, frequency response isn't all that great, although stereo alignment is pretty good. Reverberation time apparently is a 0. Early reflections is 100%, interesting. And then we've got the modal decay aspect, which at least in the left channel isn't nearly as well controlled as in the right channel. To be expected in this untreated room. So now, first we have the operational room response curves, better known as frequency response curve. And so what it does here is basically shows us the frequency response from, I think, 15 to, 25 kilohertz, something like that, in a span of 30 decibels. So this is very, very high resolution. And we can see that it tries to find out how well it fits within this ITUR limit. And that will basically determine how good the frequency response is. Yeah, apparently it's also 1/3 octave smoothing. To me, this looks more like 1/6 or some combined smoothing, but let's just take it as it is. What is great is that we then get some tips, some comments on how to address issues arising from a non-flat frequency response. Now, these are fairly generalized tips, but it's still a good place to start to know what you should be looking at in order to fix any potential frequency response issues. So then next comes stereo alignment. And so here we actually just look at this little corridor here between, 250 and 2 kilohertz. And again, that kind of gives us the score that we then see in the overall room score at the top. So this is just kind of the frequency response of the two speakers and how well they match, right? So you can see there's a lot less matching between 50 to 200 hertz. If we go back to the frequency response, we can see that that's because of these differences here in these the energy in these standing waves, I guess. So now it moves over to low frequency response, so analyzing room mode standing waves, and I'm guessing that this is in combination with the dimensions that we entered during the analysis. And so it picks up, tells us where it expects peaks to lie that are that correlate with room modes as well as dips. Yeah, and so the reason I say that it uses the dimensions is that it, for example, hasn't detected this one here, or it doesn't say that this one here is a peak or a dip from a room mode, although it does say that in the other channel, which is interesting. Again, as we had before, we have some comments about how to potentially treat these issues, how to reduce the impact of these standing waves, and then together with this table, which gives us a really nice set of actual data, we can then, first of all, obviously figure out which room modes we're dealing with, which frequencies, and then also just how strong they are, both in terms of peaks and dips. Yeah, so this is interesting if you want to compare before and after. Then we have reverberation time. And so here, typically, like it is with many of the ITU standards, it kind of reduces it down to a bandwidth that is much easier to control than full spectrum, right? So it only looks at 200 hertz to 4 kilohertz, calls that TM, and it wants that to be somewhere between 0.2 and 0.5 seconds, depending on the volume of the room. So actually in the ITU standard, you calculate the average reverb time depending on the room volume. And so that's what it tells us here. And that in this case, the ideal TM for this space should be about 0.2 seconds. And so you can see here that we're way above that, not nearly where it needs to be. That's probably why we get that 0% score. Again, some comments. And what is really interesting here, I find, is that it gives us an idea of just how much surface area we really need to cover in order to get the reverb time down to where it needs to be, even though we're only looking, or it only describes the 500 hertz frequency band. This is still a good indicator. It tells us just how much we need, and that it's usually a lot more than you'd think. That's almost 40 square meters of absorptive material in the room. Yeah. And so now, early reflections. And this one is interesting because, again, looking at time here, this is also bandwidth limited between 1 kilohertz and 8 kilohertz. And what we can see here is that after the direct sound from the speakers, the first early reflections are so low in level that they fall way below the threshold that is dictated here. I'm not entirely sure if this is also an ITU threshold. It doesn't actually say. But the interesting thing here is that this threshold is way too high, as in minus 10 decibels is nearly low enough in relation to the direct sound in order to call the room, or to call the early reflections controlled. And as you can see here, even in this empty room with some clever positioning, you can get those early reflections down to a level where they don't even nearly cause any problems. So this is kind of, at the moment, to me, the least useful of these graphs. And obviously it doesn't spit out any numbers in this table either, because none of the peaks of the early reflections actually went beyond the threshold. But then again, in the comments, we have some tips on how to treat these, how to potentially control early reflections. Again, this is, I think, great to point you in the right direction. The thing is, you can never really expect a report like this to give you specific recommendations on your room. Yeah, there are far too many different cases and instances, different possibilities for things to happen, that to cater to them all in a report like this and then filter them out in a way that makes sense for just this room. At the moment, I see that as very, very difficult. But as a guideline, as a perspective to know what you can look at in order to potentially treat these issues, I think this is it's great to have those in here. So now then we look at the time aspect in the low frequencies once more by looking at spectrograms. Yeah, so we're usually used to looking at waterfall plots. This is similar in a way. Yeah, so we've got these flames coming out from the bottom, which basically show the decay of particular frequencies, the decay time, right? And so we can see that from the color coding, it goes from 0 to minus 80 in this case. And each of these flames then represents a potential standing wave room mode, a resonance in the room. And it then tries to figure out what the modal decay time, the MT60, is for each of those frequencies. It draws in where it presumes these room modes to lie in terms of frequency, and then gives us an idea of how long those are. Now, how long the decay times of each of these are, both for the left and right channels. And it then also translates that into this modal decay time plot. And so this is quite unique and really interesting. We talked about this, Andrea and I, in our interview last week. But this is basically a threshold for audibility in terms of room resonances, right? So 20 hertz to 200 hertz, and then we've got time going up on the y-axis. And so anything that lies, any standing wave, any room resonance that lies above this line in terms of its modal decay time will be audible by this particular standard, from this assessment of audibility of standing waves, right? From this research paper that we talked about last week. And so what you can see here is that only in really the higher frequencies, the room modes it identifies actually lie above this threshold. And in the lower frequencies, we're already kind of at and below this audibility threshold. Yeah. So it's quite interesting, at least from this perspective, we wouldn't actually need any low frequency treatment in this room. Yeah, again, comes to show that the standard is setting the bar quite low. Yeah, it's fairly easy to reach. And then again, it talks about in the comments potential ways to treat these standing waves, damp these standing waves, both with resonance absorbers and porous absorbers. So this is kind of how the report is split up. Let's have a look at how this performs once we've treated the room, right? So the room that I'm going to show you, or that we're actually looking at, is this room right here. Yeah, so this is kind of the picture, the only picture I got in the most untreated state. This is a studio that I helped design for one of my clients a few years back. So this is kind of what it looked like in the empty state. And then here's what that looks like in the treated state. Okay, so it's a full build out, and let's have a look at the results. So here it is on the summary page, all green. That's nice to see. Apparently stereo alignment isn't as good as it was before, interestingly enough. And the frequency response is only slightly better, but we basically reached full score on all the others. So let's have a look at what this looks like in the report. So again, the summary for the room, here's the same table that we just looked at. So operational room response curve. right? So comparing those two, so we can see that obviously we've got a lot better damping in the low frequencies. There's a slight mismatch here in terms of the left and right channels, which we'll see in the next category. And all in all, we've got a variation of maybe plus minus 5 decibels, 10 decibels peak to peak. Yeah, for me, that is a good result. Stereo alignment. So this is before, and as you can see, for some reason, it's actually worse. And that's because of this mismatch that we just saw up here. But when we look at the low frequency response, you can really tell just how much change we got from that treatment, right? So it even has a hard time identifying any peaks and dips at all, right? Because they're basically fully damped, yeah? And we should be able to see that in the spectrogram. But first, reverb times. To be honest, I don't pay particular attention to reverb times because the metric of reverb time in a small room, especially a treated room, it doesn't exist. RT60 is needs to have a fully diffused sound field, and you just don't have that in treated small rooms. And so yes, you can measure something that it tells you is the reverb time, but in fact it's not reverb time as it is defined, as you would use it in models. So I don't care about this whole calculation of ideal reverb times at all. And as you can see here, we actually ended up with a reverb time that was way below what it should be. Yeah, the actual feeling for the space is characterized by so much more than just the reverb time. And so, yeah, I don't pay particularly attention to this. I kind of glance at it and say, okay, is this good enough? Are we in the ballpark where we need to be? And then that's fine. Early reflections, as you can imagine, not much changed, simply because it was already perfect, at least by this standard before. All right, so some of the peaks, something moved around, but they're still so low in volume that they don't even appear in this table. And now, looking at the low frequency response, the spectrogram, you can really tell just how well that treatment worked. Let's see how it compares to where we were before. Right, so down to the very lowest frequencies, there's still something happening down here at maybe, what is this, 30 hertz. But even that is going to be very, very short. And again, it doesn't even identify standing waves properly. So they're basically fully damped. And that's also what the modal decay time plot then shows us. So you can see here the few standing waves that it still recognizes are so far below the audibility threshold that they definitely don't cause a problem, at least by this standard. So yeah, this is a really fantastic tool to get an impression of how well your treatment is actually working and what you need to focus your energy on, what you should focus your time and yeah, money, well-earned money on in order to control potentially in the room. It's not perfect yet, especially the early reflections analysis to me still could use some improvement. But overall, considering this is basically free and it's super fast, it's super easy to do, what a great tool for us to now have at our disposal in order to really analyze what's going on in our rooms. And as you'll see, this probably improves over time as changes are made, as updates are made. So yeah, if you want to check it out, again, the links to all of this are going to be in the description. So I highly recommend, if you've done a set of measurements already, just upload them, give the free version a go and see just how well your room performs. And maybe let me know in the comments as well if you've done this, what you found. With that, as always, let's get back to learning to trust our ears and having fun making music in the studio. I'll see you in the next video.